Reflection in the water. In the northern mountains of Japan, where cherry blossoms bloomed each spring like promises of renewal, stood the monastery of Sirenzen. Its curved rooftops blended harmoniously with the landscape, while its stone gardens invited silent contemplation. A young monk named Kenzo had arrived at the monastery only 3 years earlier, carrying with him the weight of a spiritual quest that had begun after his father's death. Though still young, his heart was filled with profound questions about the nature of existence and the purpose of life. It was an autumn morning, when the maples had just begun to glow in shades of gold and crimson. Kenzo walked along the stone path that wound through the monastery gardens, carrying a bucket of water to tend the vegetables in the garden. The air was cool and crisp, scented with fallen leaves and the faint incense drifting from the main temple. As he passed a small clearing in the bamboo grove, something caught his attention. There, almost hidden among the gently swaying stalks, he discovered a perfectly round natural pond. The water was so still and clear it seemed like a mirror polished by the gods themselves. Kenzo approached slowly, as though afraid to disturb such perfection. Leaning over the moss-covered stone rim, he saw his own face reflected with a clarity that took his breath away. Every detail was visible. The soft lines of his youthful features, the dark eyes filled with longing, even the small imperfections that made him human. Extraordinary, he whispered to himself. Never before had he seen his reflection so vividly. The monastery held no mirrors, and the fleeting reflections in bowls or polished surfaces had always been distorted or incomplete. But here, in this hidden pond, he could behold his entire face, complete, perfect, unchanging. He remained there for a long while, captivated not only by the image itself but by the strange sensation of truly seeing himself for the first time. The reflection seemed more real than reality, more beautiful and flawless than he had ever imagined he could be. In the days that followed, a subtle yet profound change took hold of Kenzo's routine. Each morning, after the dawn chants, he found an excuse to walk the path that led to the hidden pond. At first, his visits were brief, just a few stolen minutes between his monastic duties. "I'm going to meditate in the forest," he would tell Brother Jiro when asked about his absence from the morning study sessions. And technically, it wasn't a lie. He did sit by the pond in lotus position, his hands resting in the mudra of meditation. But his eyes remained open, fixed on the reflection the water offered him. Gradually, the visits grew longer. Kenzo began to study every detail of his reflection as though it were a sacred text that needed to be memorized. He noticed how the shifting light of the day subtly transformed the image. Softer at dawn, sharper at midday, bathed in gold at sunset. He even began carrying a notebook where he wrote down his discoveries. "The morning light softens the worry lines on my forehead. At noon, my eyes seem deeper, as if they hold ancient secrets. At sunset, I am wrapped in a golden halo, as though illuminated." His fellow monks soon began to notice his absence from communal life. The head gardener complained that the vegetable beds were wilting from neglect. The librarian remarked that Kenzo no longer came to copy sutras as he was assigned. Even during meals, his mind seemed to drift elsewhere. "Brother Kenzo," said the elder monk Aishin one day, "your eyes have lost the spark of spiritual seeking. What is it that absorbs you so completely?" "I have found a place of great peace for meditation," Kenzo replied evasively. "A place where I can contemplate the nature of reality with remarkable clarity." In truth, Kenzo had begun to believe that in the pond he had found something more precious than all the teachings of the monastery. There, he could gaze upon himself free from the distractions of the outside world, free from the judgments of others, free from the imperfections imposed by daily life. It was, he thought, the purest form of self-knowledge. The change came on a Tuesday morning, when the autumn leaves had begun to fall, laying a crisp carpet across the monastery paths. Kenzo rose before dawn, as he had done for weeks, eager for his morning encounter with his reflection. The sky was heavy and gray, thick with clouds that threatened rain. A cool wind swept down from the mountains, making the bamboo groves whisper uneasily. Kenzo noticed these changes, but his anticipation of reaching the pond outweighed any concern for the weather. When he arrived at his hidden refuge, his heart stopped. The wind had transformed the pond's surface into a sea of rippling waves, crossing and colliding with one another. His reflection, that perfect face he had come to know more intimately than even his mother's, had vanished completely. In its place were distorted fragments, an elongated eye here, a warped cheek there, broken pieces of his forehead flashing in and out with each restless ripple. It was as if someone had taken his flawless image and shattered it, scattering the fragments into an unsolvable puzzle. "No, no, no," he whispered, feeling something fundamental collapse inside him. He leaned closer to the mossy edge, his nose nearly touching the water, desperate to catch even the briefest moment of stillness where his whole face might return. But the wind only seemed to grow stronger, as though nature itself were conspiring against him. The ripples grew sharper, twisting his features into grotesque parodies. In one particularly cruel instant, he saw his face stretched like a demon's, eyes pulled wide apart, mouth contorted into a hideous grimace. The anguish was physical, a pain in his chest as if something essential had been torn from him. For weeks, he had depended on that perfect image to feel whole, to know who he was. It had been his anchor in the uncertain life of the monastery, his confirmation that he existed and had worth. Now, faced with the loss of that visual certainty, Kenzo felt as though his very identity were slipping away. Who was he if he could not see himself clearly? How could he be sure he even existed if his only reliable witness had been destroyed by something as simple as the wind? He remained there for hours, waiting for the weather to change, for the wind to relent, for his world of reflections to be restored. But nature seemed to have decreed that this day would be one of unrelenting turbulence. Desperation drove Kenzo to actions he never could have imagined. On the second day of relentless wind, he returned to the pond with iron resolve. If nature would not return his reflection to him, then he would take it back himself. He began with subtle gestures, stretching his hands over the water's surface. He tried to shield at least a small section from the ripples stirred by the wind. But he quickly realized that his own movements created more disturbances than they erased. "There must be a way," he muttered, frustration rising in his voice. Withdrawing his hands, he tried a different tactic. Removing his outer robe, he spread it like a curtain between himself and the pond, hoping to block the wind. But the fabric whipped violently, adding to the turbulence in the air. In a moment of despair, Kenzo did something that would have horrified his teachers. He waded into the pond up to his knees, convinced that from its center he might carve out a zone of calm. The water was icy, seeping into his bones, but he barely noticed. He stood motionless like a statue, waiting for the waters to settle around him. Instead, every involuntary tremor of his body, every shiver from the cold, every heartbeat pulsing through his legs sent out fresh concentric ripples that only deepened the chaos. "Please!" he finally cried to the leaden sky, abandoning all monastic composure. "Just let me see myself one more time." His words were carried away by the wind, which seemed to mock his despair with every gust that whipped the pond into greater turmoil. Kenzo tried yet another tactic. Gathering fallen leaves and branches, he arranged them around the edges of the pond like a barrier, hoping to build a refuge against the wind. But the wind always found its way through, like a river slipping through cracks in a dam. It even hurled some of the leaves into the water itself, where they drifted and bobbed, adding yet more disturbances to the surface. By the end of the third day, Kenzo was utterly spent, physically and emotionally. His robes were soaked and filthy. His hands trembled from the cold and strain, and his spirit was broken. He had realized something terrible. The harder he tried to control the pond, the more chaotic it became. His own desperation had turned it into a battlefield where he was both attacker and victim. He collapsed at the edge, defeated, watching the waters churn on with a persistence that seemed to mock his every effort. And for the first time in weeks, tears welled in his eyes, mingling with the raindrops and morning dew that had begun to fall. Master Sojin had guided the Sirenzen monastery for more than 30 years. His eyes, though lined with age, still held the clarity of one who had seen through the world's illusions. Over his lifetime in the monastic path, he had cultivated a keen instinct for recognizing when a disciple was in the midst of a spiritual crisis. For several days, he had noticed Kenzo's growing absence from the monastery's daily activities. At first, he respected what he assumed might be a period of deep meditation or private study. But when other monks began remarking on damp robes left to dry at odd hours and the increasingly disheveled state of the young disciple, Sojin knew it was time to intervene. One morning, instead of going to the main hall for dawn meditation, Master Sojin quietly followed Kenzo's steps. He saw the boy slip away along the path toward the bamboo forest, moving with nervous haste and an anxious expression. Sojin kept a respectful distance, moving with the silent stillness that only decades of Zen practice could grant. When Kenzo veered toward the hidden clearing, Sojin paused behind a stand of tall bamboo, from where he could observe without being seen. What he saw broke his heart. His young disciple sat beside a pond whipped by the wind, tears streaming down his cheeks, eyes fixed on the turbulent water. His robes were wet and disheveled, his posture heavy with defeat. Sojin watched in silence for a few minutes, understanding at once what had happened. He had seen this crisis before in other students over the years. The attachment to a fleeting spiritual experience, the confusion between reflection and reality, the despair that comes when the external world cannot be controlled. He decided it was time to step forward. Emerging from the bamboo, he walked slowly toward Kenzo, making just enough noise to announce his presence without startling him. "Master," Kenzo said when he saw him, his voice cracked with emotion. He did not try to hide his state or invent excuses. In Sojin's presence, all masks felt unnecessary. "I've lost something very important. I've lost myself." "Tell me, my son," the master replied gently, lowering himself onto the damp ground beside Kenzo, unconcerned about his ceremonial robes. "What is it you believe you have lost in these waters?" Through muffled sobs, Kenzo poured out the whole story. The discovery of the pond, his daily visits, the growing fascination with his reflection, the perfection he believed he had found in that image, and finally, the devastation of seeing it shattered by something as simple as the wind. "For weeks," he confessed, "I could see myself clearly, perfectly. It felt as though I had finally found my true self. But now everything is broken, distorted. I no longer know who I am if I cannot see myself clearly in the water." The master listened with infinite patience, nodding occasionally, neither judging nor interrupting. When Kenzo finished, they remained seated in silence, listening to the wind in the bamboo and the gentle lapping of waves against the pond's edge. Master Sojin did not speak right away. Instead, he settled beside Kenzo in a natural posture of meditation and gently closed his eyes. His breathing became deep and steady, and gradually, his calm presence began to influence the restless state of his disciple. At first, Kenzo was surprised by the silence. Yet slowly, his own breath began to fall in rhythm with Sojin's. Without realizing it, his posture straightened, and his hands found a more natural place resting on his knees. They remained like this for what felt like an eternity. Kenzo, so accustomed to seeking immediate answers, grew impatient at first. His mind kept racing toward the agitated pond, toward his lost reflection, toward all the questions demanding resolution. But the master's unshakable serenity acted like an anchor, slowly quieting the inner storms of the young monk. Little by little, almost imperceptibly, the wind began to ease. The gusts that had battered the grove for days softened into gentle breezes. The bamboo leaves, which had whispered restlessly, now stirred only with a calm, hushed murmur. Kenzo noticed the change, but each time he opened his eyes to glance at the pond, the master seemed to sink deeper into meditation, as if teaching him that the answer was not to be found in outward observation, but in inward stillness. Gradually, the sound of water against the shore shifted. The irregular splashing of waves colliding gave way to a softer, more rhythmic murmur. Without opening his eyes, Kenzo could feel that something in the atmosphere was changing, but the master's example reminded him not to seek immediate visual proof. It was then that Kenzo began to notice something extraordinary. In the quiet of mind that their shared silence had created, he experienced a sense of completeness that did not depend on seeing anything at all. His identity, his very sense of being, was present regardless of any external image. For the first time in weeks, he felt no desperate urge to confirm his existence through the reflection in the water. He was simply there, seated beside his teacher, simply being. Not an image, not a reflection, but himself in a way that needed no visual confirmation. Without opening his eyes, the master allowed a faint smile to appear, as if he could sense the inner shift within his disciple. His breath remained steady, yet there was a silent quality of approval in his presence. When Kenzo finally felt the natural curiosity to open his eyes, he did so without desperation, without urgency. Only with a gentle curiosity, like a child exploring the world with no specific expectations. When Kenzo opened his eyes, the surface of the pond was completely still. Like a flawless mirror, it reflected not only his own face and that of Master Sojin, but also the sky now clearing above, the bamboo branches arching over the water, and the leaves floating gently on its surface. But something had fundamentally shifted in Kenzo's perception. Though he could see his reflection with the same clarity as before, he no longer felt that magnetic pull toward the image. It was as though he had regained a perspective he hadn't realized he had lost. "Do you see, my son?" Master Sojin said softly, opening his eyes and gazing at the calm water. The reflection never left, only the agitation. Kenzo nodded slowly, though the master sensed the understanding was still shallow. He decided to deepen the lesson. "Tell me, Kenzo," he continued, "when the wind stirred the water and you could not see your reflection clearly, did you cease to exist?" "No, master. I was still here. And when you saw your perfect image in the still water, were you more yourself than when you could not see it?" Kenzo thought for a moment. "I believed I was, but now I am not so sure." The master picked up a small stone and tossed it gently into the center of the pond. Concentric ripples spread outward, breaking the reflections once again. Kenzo felt a flicker of anxiety, but this time he was able to observe it without being carried away. "The water," Sojin explained as they watched the ripples expand, "does not create your image. It only reflects it. When you seek your true self in external reflections, you depend on conditions beyond your control. The wind, the ripples, the light, the angle of the sun, all can disturb what you see." Gradually, the ripples subsided, and the reflections began to reform. But you, the one who observes the reflection, Remain untouched, no matter what happens on the surface of the water. Your true nature is not the image you see, but the awareness that perceives the image. Something stirred deeply within Kenzo's understanding. Then, all this time, I was searching in the wrong place? It was not wrong to seek to know yourself, Sojin replied gently. But you mistook the map for the territory, the image for reality. It is like someone who tries to find the moon only by gazing at its reflection in a lake, forgetting they need only look up to the sky. The master rose slowly and walked to the far side of the pond. Come here, he said to Kenzo. When Kenzo joined him, Sojin pointed to the water. How many reflections of you are there now? Kenzo looked and saw that from this new angle, his image was indeed visible, but different. The perspective had shifted, the light had changed. The same you, said the master, but a different reflection. Which one is the true one? The master's question rang in Kenzo's mind like a bell awakening someone from a deep sleep. For a moment that seemed endless, he contemplated the different reflections he could see from various angles of the pond. Suddenly, the entire structure of his former search collapsed like a house of cards. None of them are the true one, he murmured, and then with greater certainty, they are all true, but none of them are me. Master Sojin smiled with a warmth that lit up his wrinkled face. Now you are beginning to see clearly. Kenzo sat down again, but this time not to gaze at his reflection. Rather, to take in the magnitude of what he was realizing. All this time, he said slowly, I was trying to know myself through something that was never me, like trying to know fire by looking only at its shadow. Exactly, Sojin affirmed. And when the shadow shifted or disappeared, you thought the fire had gone out. Kenzo lifted his gaze from the water and looked straight into his master's eyes. But how can I know my true nature if not through external reflections? The very question is already the beginning of the answer, said the master. The one who asks, who am I, is already here. You do not need to seek yourself because you were never lost. You were only distracted, looking in directions that could never show you what you already are. They remained silent for a long while. Kenzo experienced a strange yet liberating sensation. For the first time in months, he no longer felt the compulsive need to search for his identity in any outward form. There was a completeness in simply being aware, in simply existing without needing confirmation. Master, he finally asked, does this mean I should never look at my reflection again? Sojin chuckled softly. You may look at your reflection when you need to fix your hair before a ceremony, he said with gentle humor. But now you know the difference between using a reflection as a practical tool and seeking your identity within it. Kenzo nodded, feeling a lightness he had not known since childhood. He stood up and, for the first time in weeks, looked at the pond without anxiety, without need, without attachment. He could still see his reflection clearly, but now it was like looking at the face of an old friend, pleasant, familiar, but not essential to his sense of being. There is one last lesson, Master Sojin said, picking up another small stone. Everything in nature can be our teacher, if we know how to look. He tossed the stone into the water, and once more the ripples shattered the reflections. But this time, instead of feeling loss, Kenzo saw beauty in the very movement of the waves, in the dance of fractured light, in the constant transformation that was the natural rhythm of life. The ripples do not destroy the reflection, Kenzo observed with newfound understanding. They only transform it, and when they settle, all returns to stillness. Just like your thoughts and emotions, added Sojin. They may stir the surface of your mind, but your essential nature remains undisturbed in the depths. As they prepared to return to the monastery, Kenzo turned once more toward the pond. It was no longer his secret refuge, nor his obsession, nor the source of his anxiety. It was simply a pond in the forest, beautiful in its simplicity, perfect in its natural function. Walking back along the bamboo path, Master Sojin said, "Now that you have found what was never lost, your true spiritual practice can begin." Kenzo realized that all he had gone through was preparation. The real journey was not about finding himself in external reflections, but about cultivating inner stability that did not depend on shifting conditions. It was about learning to be like the quiet depths of the pond, unshaken, even when the surface was disturbed. Years later, Kenzo would become a teacher himself and share this story with his own disciples. He always ended with the same words: "As the moon reflects in the water without being disturbed, so should the wise contemplate the world without clinging to the images they see. For you are not the reflection you observe, but the pure awareness that observes the reflection." And in the pond of the bamboo forest, the waters continued to mirror the sky, the seasons, the faces of those who passed by, always changing, always the same, silently teaching the same eternal lesson to all who had eyes to see. This story teaches us that our true identity does not depend on how we appear in the world around us. Mirrors, the opinions of others, our achievements, even our own thoughts about ourselves, are like reflections in water. They can be useful, but they are not what we truly are. Inner peace arises when we realize that we are the awareness observing all these reflections, not the reflections themselves. This awareness remains whole and steady, regardless of whether the water is calm or disturbed. In daily life, we can apply this teaching by remembering that our worth and identity do not depend on external conditions beyond our control. Like the still depths of the pond, we can maintain our inner peace even when the surface of our lives is stirred by changing circumstances.